A loan is not simply an exchange of goods, it is an agreement about time. And once time enters an agreement, the outcome is no longer fixed. Long before coins, before markets, before formal systems of money, people were already confronting this problem. If something is given now and returned later, should it come back unchanged, or should the passage of time alter its value? This question did not emerge from theory, it emerged from the structure of survival. Before coins, before banks, belief ruled the world. In early agrarian societies, time was not neutral. Grain was planted long before it could be harvested. Herds required years to mature. Production and consumption did not align. There were periods of surplus and periods of shortage, often within the same community. This imbalance was not occasional, it was structural. Some households held more than they immediately needed. Others faced deficits that could not wait. Waiting was not always an option. Food, tools, and labor were required in the present, even if production belonged to the future. To bridge this gap, lending became necessary. Grain, livestock, and measured quantities of silver were extended with the expectation of future return. These exchanges were not yet markets in the modern sense. They were embedded in relationships, family obligations, local hierarchies, and institutional systems such as temples and palaces. Lending was part of maintaining continuity, not maximizing gain. But once time separated giving and returning, the balance changed. The future was uncertain. A harvest could fail, livestock could die, labor could disappear. Weather could disrupt entire cycles of production. What was given today could not be guaranteed tomorrow. And uncertainty increased with time. A short delay carried limited risk. A longer delay carried more. Time did not remain passive. It accumulated uncertainty. This required adjustment. What began as a simple obligation could no longer remain equal. Not because of intent, but because of exposure. The longer the delay, the greater the imbalance between what was given and what might be returned. Interest emerged as that adjustment. By the early second millennium BCE, in regions such as Mesopotamia, lending contracts began to include fixed returns. These were recorded in cuneiform tablets, specifying both the principal and the additional amount owed after a defined period. These were structured agreements, not informal promises. Grain loans commonly carried rates of around 1/3 annually. Silver loans were lower, often around 1/5. These differences followed observable logic. A bag of seed lent in the spring becomes a field in the autumn. It multiplies. A bar of silver sits in a chest, unchanged. The difference was not theoretical, it was observable. Interest, in this context, was not yet an abstract financial instrument. It was a translation. It translated time into quantity. To lend meant giving up control over resources. During that time, those resources could not be used, consumed, or traded elsewhere. The lender absorbed delay. The borrower absorbed obligation. Interest made that exchange measurable. It compensated for uncertainty. It accounted for lost opportunity. It recognized that time was not empty. It carried consequences. This introduced a fundamental shift. A debt was no longer fixed. It could grow. Time was no longer a background condition. It had become an active force within the agreement, not through additional borrowing, but through the passage of time itself. An obligation extended forward, increasing without new action. The structure of the agreement allowed it to expand independently. Nothing else needed to change. Time was enough. Time, once passive, became measurable, and once measurable, it became enforceable. This changed the nature of obligation. A delay was no longer neutral, it had a cost. This allowed something new. Value could move across time. A surplus in the present could be extended into the future. A shortage in the present could be resolved by drawing on what had not yet been produced. Production no longer had to align perfectly with consumption. But the balance did not remain stable. Because debts could grow, they could also exceed what could be repaid. What began as a temporary solution could become a persistent condition. The longer a debt remained unresolved, the more difficult it became to reverse. The structure itself intensified the obligation. Time did not reduce imbalance, it amplified it. At the level of institutions, interest could stabilize systems. At the level of households, it could intensify pressure. This created asymmetry. Lenders gained position as time passed. Borrowers faced obligations that expanded independently of their immediate capacity. The passage of time no longer eased pressure, it increased it. In institutional contexts, this mechanism could stabilize systems. Temples and palaces used interest-bearing loans to coordinate agricultural cycles, redistribute resources, and maintain administrative continuity. Lending allowed them to smooth seasonal volatility and sustain production under temporary strain. It allowed systems to function across time. At the level of households, however, the effects were different. When debts accumulated beyond what could be repaid, the consequences extended beyond material loss. Land could be forfeited, tools could be surrendered, labor could be claimed. In some cases, individuals or family members entered forms of debt servitude. These outcomes did not occur suddenly. They emerged gradually through accumulation. A small imbalance, extended over time, became structural. This is the defining characteristic of interest. It does not require escalation to produce consequence. It produces consequence through continuation. For this reason, early societies did not leave interest without limits. In Mesopotamia, rulers periodically declared debt cancellations. These resets restored balance across the system. They prevented accumulation from reaching levels that threatened social cohesion. These were not acts of generosity, they were acts of preservation. Without them, the expansion of debt could concentrate control over land and labor, undermining the broader stability required for agricultural and social systems to function. Other societies approached the problem differently. Some imposed limits on interest rates. Others restricted lending practices or confined them to specific institutional contexts. In certain cases, lending was embedded within moral or religious frameworks that discouraged excessive accumulation. Despite these variations, the underlying tension remained. Interest made time visible within economic relationships. It allowed value to extend beyond the present, but it also introduced a mechanism through which imbalance could grow without direct action. A debt did not need to be renegotiated to expand. It expanded on its own. Time had become a force, not simply a duration, but a component of value, not neutral, but active within the structure of exchange. This marked a turning point. With the introduction of interest, value was no longer confined to objects or immediate transactions. It extended into duration. It connected present decisions to future outcomes in a structured and enforceable way. But the same mechanism that enabled coordination across time also introduced instability if left unchecked. Interest did not eliminate uncertainty, it organized it. In the next episode, we will examine what happens when debt can no longer be repaid through goods or exchange, and how obligation begins to extend beyond property and into labor itself. As debt grows across time, it does not remain confined to objects. It begins to attach to people.